Hey everyone, this is Carlos. I'm the CEO at Product School, and today I'm here with a very special guest. His name is Steve Blank, and he requires no introduction. He participated in 8 different high-tech startups. He's also the co-creator of the Lean Startup movement, and he's also a professor at different universities such as Berkeley or Stanford. Hey, Steve.
Hey, Carlos, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
It's a pleasure to meet you in person. I read your first book, 4 Steps to Epiphany, and I've been obviously applying the Lean Startup movement, the Lean Startup principles for a while as a founder. I was reading at your bio on your website, and it said that you retired technically in 1999 after building 8 different startups. However, your bio after that is really, really long, right? Like it mentions how you created different courses, you also invested in different companies. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about kind of your life after you build those startups, what you learned and what you're trying to do today?
Well, Carlos, one of the nice things about being retired is retired actually means you get to do whatever you want. So my retirement career was kind of like my entrepreneurial career. I just kind of followed my passion. And that's a big idea. I did startups because they were interesting and I learned things. Even though at the end I discovered you could actually make money at the same time, but I was actually more interested in what I could learn. So since I retired, the first thing I started getting curious about was how startups were built and were there better ways to build them. And to make a long story short, which we could talk about, is learning that startups weren't smaller versions of large companies, that the startups were very different. And so the Lean Startup movement came from there. And so I started building classes in the first Berkeley and then Stanford and then Columbia University to teach entrepreneurs a different method to kind of do that. And so my last couple of decades were kind of following my passion. I also got to be a public official in California. I got to sit on environmental nonprofits, NGOs. But as I said, retirement just means, at least here, you get to follow your passion and do what you want.
I love that. And you talked about startups, which is a very confusing term because I see a lot of startups saying, we are not a startup, we're a large company, we're growing really fast. And we see a lot of big companies saying, we are a startup within a startup. So why don't we clarify the term of a startup?
So let me go all the way back to what is a startup? It turns out that that word really does confuse people. So I have friends who, I live on the coast of California, who surf, and if they could afford it, they'd be in the ocean 24 hours a day, but they have to pay the rent. So they put up a sign that says surfing lessons, 10 o'clock to 11:30. So they teach surfing to feed their passion, but their passion isn't teaching, their passion is surfing. They are entrepreneurs. They meet the definition. They don't work for anybody. They're following their passion. They have their own business, but they're actually lifestyle entrepreneurs. That is, their business is really not their passion. And by the way, they fall in the category of entrepreneurs. There are other people, another category of entrepreneurs are people who open a restaurant, or people who do website consulting or build websites, or are marketing consultants. They don't work for anybody. They have their own business. They may have 1 or 2 helpers. And by the way, their business might be quite profitable. Some of them might actually make, $1 million a year. But in fact, if you really think about it, their business has no scale and has no multiple. That is, they will get nice revenue, and you could support the family and cousins and whatever, and you could hire local people, but you're never going to get risk capital, that is angel capital or venture capital, because the returns on that business are nothing like what you would get for a scalable startup. But they are entrepreneurs. In fact, in the United States, 98% or 99% of all businesses are small businesses, but they are entrepreneurs. The third category is the one hopefully a good number of our audience comes from, are people who want to build what I call scalable startups. Startups that, in fact, the goal is to get large. And the goal is to, either large in revenue or large in users or large something. And in fact, that requires hiring not just your relatives or your neighbors, but extraordinary people from all around your region or your country. And it requires sometimes external capital for growth that will invest in a risky venture in exchange for ownership for something that might give them very large returns. And that's what a startup kind of looks like. That's a scalable startup. It's what we typically find in innovation clusters and, in different areas of Brazil or South America or Silicon Valley or, in China and Beijing or Shanghai or other places. And then there are corporate entrepreneurs. There are people who are trying to do entrepreneurship inside of a large organization that's 99% executing an existing business model. They're trying to create new business models. So I just wanted to give you and your listeners this taxonomy of like who's an entrepreneur. And by the way, one of the reasons I remind my students of this is sometimes it gets really confusing. Is if you're a small business entrepreneur, but you're trying to raise venture capital and you keep getting turned down, you get mad because they don't just get it. Actually, you're the one who just doesn't get it. It's not that your business is bad. It's your business doesn't have that potential return of 100 or 1,000 to 1. It might be making good money, but it's not a scalable business. So that's one reminder. The second one, which I think was actually the question you asked, which is about entrepreneurs in large companies. Was that the question you asked?
Well, no, you actually touched on it. It's like really glad having some clarity around what is a startup, because I also live in California, right? There's so much, so many startups where there is, in a way, small business owners who maybe have a restaurant or a co-working space. And the question for them is like, okay, when are you raising your next round? And by definition, maybe that business is not set up to be startup, but that doesn't mean that it's not a nice, profitable business.
Yes. And it doesn't mean they can't raise money from the bank or government or even relatives, et cetera. And it doesn't mean that they don't have the opportunity to open multiple restaurants if they want. And then it might be a scalable thing. But they are entrepreneurs. They're just not scalable entrepreneurs. My definition of a startup is a temporary organization designed to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. And that's a really interesting phrase, because if you're doing a startup, at least a scalable startup, the goal is not to be a startup. The goal is to be a large company. So it's a temporary organization. There's no such thing as an 8-year-old startup. There's a 2-year-old startup with a 6-year-old failure attached to it. Designed to search. Well, that's kind of interesting. What's the search part? Well, large companies execute what's known as a business model, but startups actually search for business models. That is, in a large company, you know who your customers are, you know competitors, you know pricing, you know features, etc. In a startup, you just think you do on day one, but you're actually searching for this thing called product market fit. And so you're searching for repeatable and scalable business model. Something that you do on Monday actually works on Friday, that works next week, and that scales. And scale is the key idea about a scalable startup, is that it grows large, hopefully, if you're successful, exponentially. So that's a very long answer to your first question.
It is great, because on the other side of the spectrum, I think about large companies that say, when you're trying to recruit talent, they would say, we are startup within a startup. And I can see the edge case in some case if they're building something within an organization, but I think sometimes they use it to say, hey, we're agile, we innovate, we're cool.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things, and I'll just remind your audience because it requires a little context, is that in the 20th century, startups were, to a large company, were jokes. I mean, they, no large company woke up in the morning and worried about a startup, because startups couldn't raise a lot of money, and industries were mostly stable, etc. Now in the 21st century, corporate CEOs have their heads exploding because everything they learned in business school 5 years ago is completely obsolete, except for maybe accounting. And I mean, not that they've gotten dumber, it's that the world has gotten a lot more disruptive. First of all, startups, some of them raise more money than companies have for R&D. That was just never possible before. The internet has changed the value of brands. You could create a brand now in a year, where it used to take 10, 20 years to create value. Pricing is transparent. China is a manufacturer, etc. And so large companies have realized that they're being disrupted by a series of forces that never existed before. And so they're all trying to answer that question of how do I be innovative? And a good number of them have tried to adopt these lean methods that startups use. The problem is for most large companies, it's turned into innovation theater rather than innovation. And what I mean by that is, oh, look at our accelerator and we have great coffee cups, and look, you could bring your dog to work, or whatever. And so the question to ask any large company who tells you how innovative they are, and they have a corporate accelerator, or look at our beanbag chairs, you want to ask them is, how many of these innovative ideas that have done by your innovation group actually have gotten into the hands of customers? And the answer, unfortunately, for a lot of them is, well, look at our great demos. No, I don't want to look at the demo. Everybody has demos. Show me something that your sales force is actually selling in quantity that came out of this innovation process. And what you find out is most of the time is it's not that there aren't innovative people in large companies, but large companies have processes and procedures and OKRs and metrics, et cetera, that tend to strangle innovation in its crib. And unless you fix the processes, then innovation really doesn't deliver in large organizations. Doesn't mean none of them do that, but it's much harder than just let's stand up an accelerator or an incubator inside of a large corporation, or let's paint the walls pink or something.
So you mentioned term lean. You are one of the co-creators of the lean startup movement. And I remember when I got my hands on that book, the lean startup, I think it was 2010. I literally read it the first night and I was so excited. That was like literally when I was building my first startup. Obviously the world has changed quite a bit during the last 10 or so years. So what would you say are some of the principles that still remain true today? And how has this set of principles evolved over time?
Yeah, so some of the basic principles, and I still teach this, and it's still amazing because it violates. So some of the principles of lean, just before I tell you what in your audience what they are, violates the kind of passion of an entrepreneur. If you're a great entrepreneur, you have a great idea, and the first thing you want to do is raise money and go build the idea. I mean, that's a natural DNA. That's what I used to do. Is, hey, and here are my slides. Good, let's raise money. Good, I raised money. Here are my slides. Go buy it. People gave me money. Come on, let's go. When instead, and this is just really hard, is that all you have on day one, which is still true, is a series of untested hypotheses. And I use the word hypotheses because it's a fancy word students in universities like, but it actually means you're just guessing. You're guessing about a lot of things on day one. You're guessing about the problem you think you're solving. In fact, you don't even think about the problem you're solving. You think about what a cool product this is. Well, wait a minute. It's a cool product. Why? Well, everybody will want it. Well, how do you know that? Well, I want it. Well, okay. Well, who else wants it? Well, my co-founder wants it. Okay, if you two buy it, is that enough to make the company successful? No. Well, how will you know? Well, we'll build it. We'll raise all this money. Well, maybe we got to ask a couple of people. Well, who should I ask? Well, how about we figure out who you think might want it? Okay, I can write that down. Great. Let's go out and talk to them. Oh, no, I need to build a product first. No, you don't. Why don't you figure out if this thing, if you build it, would it solve a problem? Or if it's entertainment, would they play it? Or what are they playing now? Or what are they using now? Or that is, every startup is built on a set of assumptions that unless you test them, you only find out later after you spent money, built products, hire people, et cetera, that you're wrong. And so one of the key ideas about the whole lean methodology is there are no facts inside your building, so get the heck outside. And the part I created of lean, the one of three pieces, is called customer development, which basically says, look, not only are there no facts inside the building, the odds of you being smarter than the collective intelligence of your potential customers is probably as close to zero as any safe bet. So why don't we just spend a little amount of time, not run focus groups, but actually test hypotheses? And so while we're doing that, we now could do something we never could have done in the 20th century and actually show them iterative and incremental versions of a product using something called agile engineering. That was Eric Ries's contribution that says, Steve invented customer development, but no one uses waterfall anymore. That is the serial process of building products. Software and hardware could be built iteratively. So why don't we take that and we could search for something called product market fit? Have we found the right customers with the right feature set? Oh, look at that. We have, or no, we haven't. So we're allowed to iterate the customers, iterate the features, and also change maybe what potential customers we're talking to, and maybe change prices, etc. And the third part of Lean was simply, well, what hypotheses, what guesses or assumptions should I be testing? And that came from someone named Alexander Osterwalder, who created something called the business model canvas, which if your viewers haven't seen it, it's worth going out and looking up the canvas. It's basically a single piece of paper with 9 hypotheses on it. Who are your customers? What are you building for them? And he has a fancy word called value proposition, but it's what hardware or software or service, et cetera, are you providing those customers? Great. What's your distribution channel? Is it as simple as an app store, whether it's Google Play or Apple, or is it a retail distribution or something, or licensing? How are you going to keep and grow those customers? Customer relationships. How are you going to make money? First of all, what's the strategy? Is it a direct sale? Is it a license? Is it a freemium product? And then kind of in the background, what are the key strategic activities you need to be expert at? If you're building a AI company, you ought to have, as a co-founder, some AI people. And so which resources do you need inside? And what resources can you partner with third parties for? So activities, resources, and partners. And then finally, what are the costs? Those are some of the key assumptions now about what you're doing and outside the building. Now, if you think about it, these 3 components, customer development, agile engineering, and business model canvas, are what we call the lean startup. And it allows us to do things that entrepreneurs never had permission to do, and we never even had a language to do in the 20th century. And can I explain what those are, Carla?
Sure.
Yeah. So in the 20th century, it's hard to believe this, but trust me, I had to live this. The way you would build a product is the founders would have a great idea and they put together PowerPoint slides. Sound familiar? Okay. You go raise money. All right. Sound familiar? If you got money from a venture capitalist, they would bless your idea, put holy water over it by handing you millions of dollars. And you would assume that you were a genius. You would assume the only problem between you and retirement was building the product, because VCs said you were a genius. They gave you money, they read your plan. Oh, by the way, you wrote a business plan with a 5-year forecast. That is, you were predicting the future based on no facts, but that's okay. They agreed that was going to happen. And then you built the product with what was called waterfall development. That is a serial step-by-step process. You wrote a marketing spec, and engineering turned it into an engineering specification document. And then you locked engineers in a room and you fed them soda and caffeine and free food and believe it or not, products and software and hardware took years to develop, not days or weeks or months. And then when the product was about to be released, engineering tested it in an alpha test and beta test, just whether it was buggy enough. They really didn't care whether customers wanted it. They wanted to know whether it crashed the system or killed people or something else. And then you ship the product. And everybody had a big party. We had a product launch, and everybody would high five each other. And then the first board meeting, people would ask the VP of sales, how we doing? And he or she, but back then it was mostly he, would say, great pipeline, which meant, oh, lots of interest, but no orders. And this would continue for 5 or 6 months until they realized no orders were coming. And so they'd fire the VP of sales. And they replaced the VP of sales, and a new VP of sales would come in and they do the same thing. And then they fire not the VP of sales, because the new VP of sales would blame it on the VP of marketing. And finally, the company would shut down.
So what's interesting in this part, my company is actually inspired by your customer development methodology. We teach product management, and I felt that pain so many times where product didn't have a seat at the table. You mentioned it's the VP of sales or the VP of marketing, maybe in some cases the VP of technology, but product was almost there in the hidden, right?
Yes.
And now we're seeing more organizations that have a CPO role or a VP of product that is able to at least co-create with market and not have to wait for market to tell them what to build, and then they just go
Yes.
check more.
And I wanted to tell you this long story of how it used to work to point out a couple of interesting things. The only time back in the 20th century, and some companies now, you had permission to change the features of the product is when you fired an executive. Because if I fired the VP of sales, you go, oh, well, maybe it was missing these features. So then you would add features. You fired another executive, you'd say, well, maybe we're talking to the wrong customers. If you think about what Lean allows us to do now, and this is a key concept, it's this word pivot. And a pivot means a substantive change to any part of the business model canvas or any part of your business model. A pivot gives entrepreneurs permission to say, I've been out of the building, I've been testing my hypothesis about features or product or pricing, and it's not working over here. So let me change who my customers are, or let me try a different experiment with, they're telling me it's features 3, 7, and 12 they pay money for. Let me prioritize those and see what happens. Once you have that permission, that's what allows you to be rapidly agile. That allows you to move with like a blur. And so this idea of a pivot just never existed before. This idea of a minimum, what we call minimum viable product, this idea of testing very early on, iteratively, never existed before either.
And I find fascinating that some of those concepts, pivot, minimum viable product,
Yep.
product market fit,
Yep.
Getting out of a building, maybe these days it's
Yep.
more about getting out of Slack or your inbox, whatever that might be, or Zoom,
Yeah.
they stay true over
Yes.
10 years later.
Yes, yes, because the nature of business is kind of fundamental. I mean, what's really interesting is, you know, when we started building this methodology, I said, maybe it's a fad, or maybe I'm wrong. You know, in fact, I used to sit with Eric Ries every once in a while and go, what if we're wrong? You know, we're making everybody do the wrong thing. It turns out we now have enough data to say, listen, it's somebody will probably come up with something much better, hopefully in another 20 years. But there seems to be some fundamental things about startups that we have discovered that we just weren't doing correctly for the first 25 years or so. And I'm kind of both surprised and happy that these things have turned out to be fundamental truths about building companies, not just fads. We have discovered, though, a couple of new things, Carlos. It's one of the things you asked earlier. You know, I used to insist that customer discovery, as the first part of getting out of the building, had to be done in person, because I said you needed to watch people's facial expression, and you need to watch them whether they're looking at their watch or, you know, actually reading their phone when you're trying to talk to them, or whatever. And I said, well, you can't do that via email or telephone or a Survey Monkey. That's not customer discovery, until the pandemic. And then getting out of the building meant you were going to die or get arrested. And so we ran a huge experiment of, can you do sufficient customer discovery via Zoom or Google Meet or any type of video? And the answer for, I'd say, most cases is there's no reason on earth now to do your first customer discovery visit in person. In fact, it's a waste of time. And the reason why is it's not as good as in person. That is, Zoom will never replace, you know, watching everybody's eye rolls next to each other, or them doing this, or actually people are actually reading their phone. But you could do 5 to 10 more of them in a day than you could driving across town or flying across country or whatever. And so volume here makes up for kind of the missing pieces of connectivity. You still need, so let me just put that as a stake in the ground. The first pass of customer discovery, you know, unless it's really you're going to get to visit, you know, the capital of your country and the president's going to meet you, it's probably worth passing on a which sometimes happens, or you're going to go on an aircraft carrier or visit something else. But subsequent meetings, that is follow-on meetings, where discussions are now getting hands-on, and because it's really hard to demo an MVP, you know, that has physical use, or people want to push buttons or whatever. That's harder. And so it's not like we can eliminate in-person meetings completely, but it's changed for me, and I invented the methodology, my mindset about, no, let's kind of adapt and adopt what's just happened here. We've run a giant science experiment. So customer discovery and customer validation is now kind of a hybrid of doing rapid Zoom meetings to gather as much data as you can, and then judiciously, that is selectively pick which meetings do you need to follow up in person. People need to hold products, you need to see the physical building, if it's hardware or the size of things or other equipment in the room or other whatever. Does that make sense, Carlos?
Totally. I was going to add one thing that I've observed over the years is how technology has become much more visual. Now,
Yes.
building a product doesn't require that much of a technical expertise. Meaning, I remember when I was in San Francisco participating in weekend hackathons, we had 2 days to actually use the business model canvas, get off the building, interview customers, and the end goal of that weekend was to have a presentation, and that was it. These days, those hackathons are much more about building something, because you can prototype, yes, you can design and get, doesn't need to be an end product, but the definition of the MVP has evolved a little bit, I guess.
Yes, and in fact, if you think about the underlying cause of why that is open source has dramatically changed our ability to stand. We were basically standing on everybody's shoulders. It's hard to believe, but in the 20th century, hardware and software was an individual craft. That is, we all redid our work time and time again because no one shared anything. And just GitHub by itself probably changed the world, but there's also open hardware platforms, etc. The other piece, by the way, that's radically changed everybody's life, and we take it for granted now, like we take electricity for granted, is Amazon Web Services. When I was an entrepreneur, what you did with your first round of funding was you bought a computer, a mini computer, right? And you typically bought a DEC VAX, whether you're building hardware or software, it would cost you $1 million. And then you spent another $1 million on software to run on top of it. Nowadays, I tell that to my students and they go, like, were you born in 1850? I mean, when did that happen? And it turns out we just take for granted that computing is infinite. Computing is just a click away. And so think about it, open source, computing as a utility, and more importantly, conferences like this. When I wanted to understand how innovation and entrepreneurship worked, I had to have coffee with someone, and luckily I lived in Silicon Valley, and I was limited by my coffee bandwidth. Nowadays, everybody kind of who's watching this on Twitch and everywhere else, your problem is how to sort out all the information you're getting for innovation and entrepreneurship, because there's a million pieces of advice, and some of them, in fact, probably all of them, if you add them up, are mutually contradictory. So now your problem is what is the right path to take, rather than I don't have enough information. And there's more books on lean and startups and whatever in multiple languages. Some of them I don't even recognize.
And I think the cost of office now with remote work has also decreased significantly.
Right. So thank you. So now that's started pre-pandemic, but now for sure, this idea of remote work was kind of, well, maybe, yeah, we'll hire somebody outside of Silicon Valley. Yeah, we'll have a remote office. Now it's like, convince me why we need an office. And what this really does is it's globalized entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship. The only thing that's still probably regional, and I think that's also breaking down, but probably at a slower level, is, first pre-pandemic, angel funding was available almost everywhere. I mean, you could probably raise a good enough pre-seed or early stage in almost any country or region. I mean, I'm sure your viewers could tell me the towns that they can't, but that might be a function of their idea rather than the money. But in most places and by the way, that never existed. But what I saw during the pandemic is venture capitalists actually using Zoom to fund things in places they would never fund, and writing, seed checks or Series A, depending where you are. I mean, millions of dollars of money for people they've never even physically saw in person. Some of that is changing back, but some of it is still going on, which kind of globalized, the next round of funding. But what still requires, I think, access to an innovation cluster is if you need capital at scale, probably north of 20 million or 50 million or $100 million, there's still only certain places in the world, though are expanding, where you could raise that capital, right? Maybe 10 or 15 places. And some of them still require physical access, or at least, physical connections to those folks. that'll eventually change as well. Um, but it's really interesting to see how innovation and entrepreneurship not only is spread, but if you remember, without risk capital, and what I mean by risk capital is not your bank, not your parents or friends, but crazy people who are equally insane as you are, who finance startups. If you think about it, having entrepreneurs and innovators in a region without risk capital is like one hand clapping. It doesn't work. You need both of those to exist for you to have an innovation cluster, or else those innovators go elsewhere. Does that make sense?
Totally. And let's double click on that, because I'm actually taking a question from the audience. I can imagine how a new startup has an easier time embracing some of these principles because they don't have that much resistance to change. However, for the folks who are working in larger organizations, what would you say are some ways for those larger organizations to kind of take some baby steps and incorporate some of those principles? Quick examples. Are we talking about acquiring a startup? Are we talking about hiring younger, more innovative people to kind of spark things up? Like, how are you seeing this being successfully implemented?
Yeah, let's start with the things that don't work well. Is when the managing directors or the board of directors tell the CEO, you need to be innovative, and they tell someone that says, oh, we need an incubator, and they set up a fancy thing, and all those things die inside the incubator. That is, they hire smart people and create great demos, and the rest of the organization says, well, it's not on my list, or wait a minute, this is a great product, but it'll kill our existing products, or engineering says, well, to scale this thing, they used a different API and a different stack. It doesn't match anything we're building. I'm not budgeted or scheduled for this, and so the first thing that needs to happen in a large company is actually to have a innovation pipeline and process that's agreed by the exec staff, not as a single point organization. I've usually seen those fail miserably because the rest of the organization is not simply aligned. And let me give you another taxonomy, because I like to think about how to organize things. About 30 years ago, a consulting firm called McKinsey came up with a model for large company innovation, which I still think is worth thinking about. They said there are 3 horizons, or 3 types of innovation in a large corporation. Horizon 1 is hopefully what every company is already doing, and that is adding more features to existing products, right? You're making existing products, it's continuous improvement of existing products. And hopefully you're doing that with a combination of great engineering, but also great insight from your customers. Hopefully you're getting data from the field, and you're watching competitors, and you're watching trends, etc. And Horizon 1 innovation belongs inside of existing P&L groups or functional organizations. It doesn't require a new org. Horizon 2 innovation, though, is maybe, like, I have some great products, but maybe I should find some different customers. Or maybe I could find a different distribution channel. I've been selling things retail. Maybe some things could go online. Or I'm online, maybe, some retail channels or some partners, etc. That requires sometimes in the existing division, but sometimes requires a standalone group outside. Some parts of the business model are the same, but some might actually create conflict inside the organization. And anytime there's conflict wired in, you want to figure out how to build both a separate group, but that's tied with incentives to the core. And then the third type of horizon is Horizon 3. These are disruptive innovation. This is Apple doing the iPhone. They were a computer company. This is Netflix becoming a Hollywood studio. At least, I don't know if there's Netflix in your country, but Netflix used to mail DVDs to you, right? Like, how did they become a studio? Those were pretty disruptive and require different standalone groups because, in fact, they threaten the existing organizations. So that's idea 1. Idea 2 is that's if a company wants to build innovation inside. But you remember, large companies have a lot more moves than startups. Large companies could acquire IP, intellectual property. They could acqui-hire. They could just buy people, or small teams. They could buy or acquire product lines. They could do joint ventures, or they could acquire entire companies. those are moves that startups who are typically just focused on executing their own business model don't have. The problem with large companies when they do that is I've seen as having sit on both public and private boards on both sides of this, when large companies do acquisitions, they almost always kill the innovation. And they almost always kill it because they don't understand the phase of the company they're acquiring. At some phases, and I won't go into it here, but it is worth thinking about, you certainly do want to deeply integrate all the functions together. Great, we just got all their people, they now have our HR system and our finance system and our Salesforce and the employees. But there are other times when you do that in a life cycle of a large company acquiring a startup, you kill every piece of innovation you thought you were going to acquire, and all the people quickly leave. They might stay for their 1-year earnout or whatever, but you can almost write the script of what happened here. And it's what happens is that people who acquire really don't understand the culture and what are the innovation drivers and the thing that they acquired. By the way, this is a pretty easy fix, but it's usually understood after you've screwed it up. So Carlos, I hate to tell you, I forgot your question, but I hope I answered some of it.
You actually touched on it. It was about like different ways a large organization can incorporate some of these lean startup principles by collaborating with startups, and I think you broke it down nicely. And there's a fundamental question that I keep coming to mind as you talk about validating hypotheses, getting out of the building, testing ideas. Is like, when it's so easy to lie, to cheat on ourselves, right? I mean, like, okay, I went out of the building, I asked all of these questions, my users told me what I wanted, great, I'm going to build. So what are some like good ways for us to stay honest and also stop to not over analyze and question and at the same time start building?
Yeah, so the biggest, I think I started with telling you the passion of an entrepreneur is let's start building. So for those of you watching who feel that way, screw this process. Welcome to the club. I mean, like I felt that way for the 20 years I did this. And by the way, the whole idea of lean is not to diminish that passion or to slow it up. It's a big idea. I want everybody to hear this. For me, the whole process of getting out of the building was to validate the founders' hypotheses. It wasn't to question them. It was to say, assume you're right. Just humor me. Just humor me. Just, I'm an old guy. Make me happy and talk to 10 people who say you're absolutely right. And of course, they talk to 10 people and go, well, I must have talked to the wrong 10 people. And then you talk to another 10. And so that's when reality meets. And so the simple test is, look, why don't you humor me and let's write down what problem do you think you're solving? And by problem, as I said earlier, are you entertaining people, or is the hypothesis that people will want better X or Y? Let's just make sure that someone other than you has that problem. Forget about the product. Don't take your slides. Just go talk to 10 people about the problem you think they have. And of course, you can almost always they come back and, well, no one else has the problem, or yeah, they have that problem. But what I used to discover, the one I thought, it was number 17 on the problems they have, and they were only buying solutions to the top 5. I wasn't even on the list. So I was kind of right? And then, so you will change and you'll understand that. The next thing is now test the solution. Oh, that's when I get out the canvas and whatever. Yeah, I understand the problem. And obviously they want these features that look like this. Just talk to 10 people. No product market fit. Now, you don't have to do that. You could raise a ton of money and in some places in the world and just hire people and, do it. And if it's wrong, hire more people, et cetera. And you're actually iterating on someone else's cash. No one is going to shoot you and no one's going to put you in jail. It's just not efficient. If you're great at this lean process, it's very quick. It's almost transparent. And it is kind of an honest broker on yourself. The best way I've seen this work, Carlos, is when your board members at board meetings stop asking about first year's revenue and start saying, well, what did you learn in your first 20 interviews with customers? That's all a board has to do in the first board meeting. All of a sudden, if that culture is set, that we're not hitting you with a stick to meet some imaginary hockey stick, but in fact, the premise of actually getting to any exponential growth is based on product market fit. Tell me what you learned, either in, building MVPs or talking to people or whatever, and what's your process for doing so. If board members start just simply asking CEOs that, then that will kind of get baked into the culture. And I've seen great boards do that. Obviously, they care about exponential growth because that's where liquidity is somewhere up here. But it usually happens more efficiently when that's an integral part of the process.
Love that. And I think that that mindset of like, what did you learn, or learning
Yes.
fast instead of just failing fast and like punishing
Right.
for failure, it
Right.
really changes the mindset to be more focused on growth and long-term results rather than like, okay, here is your return on this specific idea.
Yep.
Cool, Steve. It's been a pleasure to chat with you. Thank you so much for your time. Now we're going to take some additional questions for the private members. But yeah, it's been awesome. Thank you.
These were great questions, Carlos, and good luck to everybody in your new ventures.